This is 6-year-old Ruby Bridges being escorted by a group of federal agents to an all-white school in Louisiana.
Will not force my people to integrate against their will.
I didn't want them to go to school with the to kick those kids out of school.
200 people waiting at 8:30 in the morning to tell her they were going to kill her.
Just 45 years before this event, in Kerala, South India, a Dalit girl called Panchami from the Pulia community was being escorted to a privileged caste-only school by a man called Ayyankali. That school was later burnt down by the privileged caste community in the area, leaving us with this burnt bench as a memorial. The privileged caste community did not want their children sharing the same spaces as the children of the marginalized for fear of ritual pollution. I've accepted that this video might not be a very popular one. It's probably going to be too long and too detailed for YouTube, but I really want to do the topic justice. I've read at least 60 odd different journal articles and a couple of books in preparation for this, and you'll find all of them in the reference list attached. Feel free to dive deeper. I'm going to talk about things I've learned about systems that dehumanize people from birth. Innocent people in service of a hierarchy that benefits only a few. A system legitimized by men who claimed to hear the words of God, who touted the idea that some are more deserving of respect and basic human rights than others.
Nous avons de bons rapports avec les Indiens, mais nous ne nous marions jamais avec eux.
I must urge you to resist making any broad sweeping generalizations from this video, especially if you might be a viewer who isn't already acquainted with Indian culture or history. This essay was tricky to write because in online spaces like this one, the common person from India can be sandwiched between the racist narratives about our people from the West, which are rooted in white supremacy, and used against minorities in diaspora. And on the other hand, in India and on the rest of the subcontinent, one needs to contend with generations of Brahminical hegemony and caste-based segregation. Both conservative worldviews have a part to play in sustaining the current neoliberal capitalist situation. There's a significant amount of misinformation around caste, how it functions, when it was created, what it even is, and who is responsible. In the context of today's world, racism against Indians is fairly common online, so it's not uncommon to see the word caste used as some kind of racial cudgel as well, to justify vile racism against our people. Indians in diaspora have to deal with harmful consequences of these misconceptions, and Indians within India have to fight the slow erasure of the ability to even talk about this. As part of the modern Hindutva project of historical revisionism, many right-wing intellectuals have tried to claim that caste was a British invention or a colonial creation by the Portuguese, and that life before they arrived was just fine, glorious even. These half-truths allow the RSS machinery to redirect attention away from real problems within society and onto some kind of external threat, while trying to maintain a separate but unified Hindu voting bloc. Privileged caste groups have much to gain from erasing the discussion of caste from public spaces, like in the case of the United States, where many white folk who happen to be in privileged positions within society deny that racism even exists. In India today, many privileged caste folk deny that caste-based discrimination exists.
So I have stated in the past that the caste system is a Western invention. Many of you have been skeptical and you have said that this is all something I pulled out of my hat. It's not. point is this is a British creation. The Kshatriyas have been the aristocrats. The Brahmins have been the ones who preserved the country's knowledge, the civilization's knowledge for thousands of years. We respect people who are knowledgeable, right? People who are learned, people who are scholarly, we worship them. That is because of our inbuilt reverence for knowledge. It is built into our DNA. And naturally, the people who were the most learned for thousands of years were the people who passed it on from generation to generation, the Brahmins.
Madras Presidency is where caste was created. Read this fantastic book called The Caste of the Mind by Nicholas B. Dirks. On this, what we have basically said is at least the society and universities must start talking about it. But that entire domain is occupied by post-colonial Marxists and Nehruvian establishment. You wanted a caste census, you did not ask for a Varna census. You didn't ask for a Jati census. There is a huge distinction. In that book, you will see proof of the fact that caste comes from casta, which is the first Portuguese word. Why Portuguese word? Why Portuguese word?
This uncle over here, for instance, is using colonialism or weaponizing it to justify erasing any discussion of caste discrimination within India. This allows right-wing grifters from privileged caste groups to make everything a skill issue. And they like to make the claim that Dalits, Adivasis, and other marginalized groups simply haven't worked hard enough like they have, which is why they're still marginalized. This kind of rhetoric should be familiar. Some in the diaspora who might be born into a privileged caste community outside India have to deal with a completely different social context. In the US, for instance, they are forced to inherit the toxic dehumanization and racism against Indians and non-white people that may nudge one into finding value in appeasing systems of white supremacy. Like how Nikki Haley, for instance, who was born into a privileged caste Punjabi home, attempted to completely change her identity to attain whiteness. Caste must be understood in terms of power structures and social hierarchies of control. It uses narratives of biological essentialism as validation for things being the way they are. Conflict and struggle through oppression, systemic bias, and racism have always been a factor in the history of all humanity. Where there is capital to be stolen, hoarded, and controlled, you will find weaponized narratives of biological essentialism. And no race or culture is magically exempt from that. Many voices among the marginalized, like Dr. Ambedkar and W.E.B. Du Bois, have written about how race and caste interact with capital. But their work often goes unnoticed in mainstream conversations about capitalism and Marxist thought. Ambedkar and Du Bois had even exchanged letters talking about the similarities between caste in India and how race operated in America. Ambedkar wrote in his undelivered speech, Annihilation of Caste, that caste is not a division of labor. It is a division of laborers. He also quite prophetically pointed out that socialists would need to fight the monster of caste either before or after the revolution, indicating that caste wouldn't just resolve itself if India got an independence or if economic conditions alone improved within a capitalist system. Du Bois wrote about the concept of caste education and how schools played a role in preserving caste society, a caste society established during the colonial plantation period. Du Bois's work, Black Reconstruction, is both a critique and an advancement of Marx's Eurocentric and class-based theorizations. Du Bois differed from Marx's understanding of a progressive stage-based history. Marx posited that capitalism comes after a slave-based economy, but Du Bois offers us the perspective of a racial capitalist system, in which racial ideologies and social structures that arise from capitalism interact with each other. Slavery and capitalism were not independent or hierarchical to one another, but rather cooperative systems of power, which were integral to the political and economic development of the United States. In the US, the capitalist system artificially fused an occupation, slave work, to, as Du Bois put it, black blood. This binding between one's bloodline and an occupation is also present in the systems in India. The obvious difference between the racial system in the US and the caste-based systems within India is one of skin color. In India, skin color as a differentiator was introduced much later, thanks to the white supremacist ideas brought in as early as the Greeks and all the way up to the British. At the end, it became the white British against the native. As we will discuss in this video, pre-colonial caste worked without the need for even skin color. It had more to do with family lineage and occupation identified by surnames and geographical location of residence. When skin color alone isn't an effective discriminatory tool, we humans, being the creative little baboons we are, came up with jewelry, clothing, even hairstyles as caste markers to more easily discriminate. Even today, Dalit people have to endure violence just for sporting a specific kind of mustache, for wearing sunglasses, or even if they have the audacity to wear a turban, because of constructed ideas of status associated with these superficial traditions. Artificial values of purity or competency were imposed upon marginalized lineages in order to justify having a permanent underclass of laborers. In other words, if you were born into the home of a bricklayer, then you must also fulfill your duty of being a bricklayer, just like your father was. Why? Because God said so. Right-wing regressive elements around the world have attempted to co-opt indigeneity, and when they can't co-opt it because it's too steep of a lie, they've chosen to use vague sets of historical values to identify and appeal to an in-group. It's a common sight to see oppressive movements using the language of being under attack, branding criticism as anti-Christian or anti-American in the case of the US, anti-Semitic in the case of Israel, anti-Muslim in the case of the Pakistani state, anti-Hindu in the case of India. But if you look just a bit closer, they always represent the affluent community at the top of their respective hierarchies within the capitalist systems that they operate in. In India, the Hindutva movement is predominantly a privileged caste movement seeking to preserve privileged caste values and capital. In the case of Pakistan, it's the same, just under different religious guise. The Pakistani state, for instance, is concerned not just with oppressing non-Muslims, but also other Muslims, like the Ahmadiyya community, Afghan Muslims, Baloch, the Khwaja Sara or trans community, and so on. Being progressive in any society is an uphill battle, because we're fighting against generations of oppressive, unequal systems and traditions that have rooted themselves deep in our cultures, that merely change their masks every few years. It's remake after remake after remake. Conservative elements from all nations have a repository, a library even, of racist tropes, sexist talking points, and other problematic learned social behaviors that they can just tap into from our collective pasts. Want to mobilize the racists? Target critical race theory. Or now DEI. Want to mobilize the misogynists? Attack feminism or perpetuate stereotypes about welfare queens or whatever it is these guys are doing now. Mobilize the castists? Attack the idea of reservations and hide behind the guise of merit, while ignoring the generations upon generations of enslavement of your own people. There's no simple way to understand caste without historical context, so I will attempt to contextualize it with the history of an often overlooked but important part of the ancient world, my state of Kerala, the native home of black pepper. And honestly, I haven't seen anyone do an analysis of caste and anti-caste movements from the perspective of Kerala on YouTube recently, so there you go. During the Sangam period, between 300 BCE and 300 CE, the landscape of South India was one dominated by the three kings, the Cholas, the Pandyas, the Cheras, and their allied chieftains. It was a time where even the word Hindu was unheard of in the south. It was a word that had been used far off in the north by the Persians to identify the people who lived beyond the Sapta Sindhu river. In short, they couldn't pronounce the word S in Sindhu, so you got Hindu. Anyway, the people of the southern region, historians refer to as Tamilagam, performed ancestor worship and venerated tribal gods that were Dravidian and not Aryan, not Hindu. For instance, the worship of the indigenous goddess Kotravai, the goddess of war, was common among the Chera chieftains of Kerala. People wouldn't go to a temple either. Instead, they would go to what's called a kavu, or in English, a sacred grove. These kavu would be in forests where they could connect with ancestor spirits and deities, a practice which continues to this day in the form of ritual performances like Theyyam. The social structures found in these societies was feudalistic in nature, with various territories controlled by rival chieftains and allies, a structure that could be found in many parts of the world at the time. This was no utopia, let's be honest. Kings be kinging, chiefs be chiefing, I guess. But it was a golden age of trade, relative peace, and coexistence. This is why the Sangam period was known as the Golden Age of the South. The ports of Tondi, Muiri, Arikamedu, Korkai, and Marakanam were busy with Greco-Roman, Assyrian, Babylonian trade. Pliny the Elder of Rome referred to the port of Muiri in Kerala as the first emporium of India in his work titled Natural History. While all this was happening, somewhere up in the north, in ancient UP and West Bengal, in the old Mauryan Empire, Brahmin priests began to codify generations of puritanical social norms of control into written law. Brahmin priests who claimed to be in communion with Brahma or God penned the Manusmriti, or the laws of Manu, which would become very important in a couple hundred years in the context of Kerala. The 2nd century BC also saw an influx of Buddhist communities and Jain trading guilds into Kerala. Historians suggest that this coincided with the rule of Emperor Ashoka of the Mauryan Empire, who had converted to Buddhism at the time. If you aren't familiar with Indian religions besides the modern day Hinduism, here's a very brief introduction to Jainism and Buddhism. They were ancient religions that developed independently of each other, but around the same time, and they share a lot of similarities. Both religions were formed in the northern part of the Indian subcontinent and became very popular around the 5th century BCE, and both of them were created as a direct opposition to Brahminism. They rejected the Vedas and did not believe in the idea of a creator god. Buddhists viewed karma as an amorphous spiritual concept, but Jain priests believed that karma constituted actual physical particles that could not be seen by the human eye. That's just a very brief intro for those who may not be familiar. I'd suggest looking into them in your own time if you're interested, perhaps starting with Let's Talk Religions videos. In a book written by an anonymous Greek trader, Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, there are at least 200 pages worth of details about trade relations between ancient Indian kingdoms and places like Yemen, Oman, Rome, Abyssinia, otherwise known as Ethiopia today. Jewish and early Christian traders visited Kerala's ports of Muiri, settled in the coasts, and traded with the Chera chieftains. Being one of the largest main sources of black pepper at the time, besides cinnamon, other spices, muslin, coconut fiber, and so on, they were moving some product. Archaeological evidence suggested that there were a few Brahmin households on Chera chieftain lands, but we don't have any evidence from the time of land grants being given to priests by the chieftains, which is usually an indication of how influential a Brahmin community would have been at any given time. Instead, there's much more evidence to suggest that the indigenous chieftains of Kerala favored ancestor worship, forms of animism, and Buddhism. Many Jain and Buddhist monasteries were erected during this time. Historians and archaeologists agree that Buddhism was one of the most important forms of worship after ancestor worship. The 6th century CE marked the beginning of trade with the Islamic world and the Tang dynasty in China, which replaced the dying trade from the Roman Empire at the time. In my town of Fort Kochi, for instance, the fishing communities still use the Chinese fishing nets on a daily basis for their livelihood, something that you don't see in any other part of India. And I need to emphasize this point for the Hindu nationalists watching right now. The first mosque in India was built in Kerala in 629 CE. No evidence of interreligious violence, no evidence of forced conversions, just peaceful trade. I know some of you Islamophobes are probably cringing by now, but deal with it. Muslim, Christian, and Jewish communities had established themselves as prominent communities along the coast, and they coexisted peacefully with tribal chieftains. From the 6th to 8th centuries, the Chera chieftains saw a decline in prominence, becoming vassals to neighboring Pandyas, Rashtrakuta, and Chalukya dynasties. At this point, we need to take a peek at what was happening in those dynasties to get a glimpse into what the Kerala people were about to experience. The Chalukya dynasty at this time had already transitioned into having a segregated, rigid society based on the Brahminical Chaturvarna system, the four Varna system, a religious hierarchical system of control that would be imposed upon the Jatis, which you can understand as lineage or ethnic communities. Jatis is what we're really talking about when we even flippantly use the word caste, because that's what really represents the groups of humans who are then slotted into this four-tier Varna system. This was done in order to dictate land rights, marriage, personal laws, and ritual status. It is essentially a failed, cynical system employed by the ruling castes for the purpose of social dominance. You will notice that I'm using the term Brahminical here specifically, because again, this was a system conceived of, written about, and propagated by Brahmins, male Brahmin priests specifically, who held high stations in the courts of kings. Let's spend some time talking about these definitions here, because the lack of understanding around the words Jati and Varna is also used by Hindutva fascists in propaganda videos in the West and at home to divert from the word caste.
I will tell you what that context is, and that context is that there is a whole new version of Marxism called critical race theory, popularly called wokeism. Dalits were invited to Harvard and encouraged to combine forces with the African Americans and Muslims and others who felt that they are oppressed, to create what's known as critical caste theory, which says that the Dalits of India are the blacks. Wokeism started with a very innocent idea that asking blacks to wake up. Woke means woken up.
It's a grand social structure that the Indian civilization produced, which actually resulted in the diversity that we see in society today. We see Varna pride, we see different languages, different foods, different culture, different ways of dressing, different ways of worship, and that's the real diversity. India is the only civilization that can say that we've produced diversity.
So there is caste abuse, no doubt, but we cannot locate it on Vedic origin. My problem is not fighting caste abuse at all. My problem is fighting Vedas and Hinduism as the cause of caste abuse.
We don't have caste, we have Varna and Jati. It explains that these are actually ways of preserving diversity. It's not against diversity, it is for diversity. Because rather than a homogeneous society, a society where different people have different talents and they all work together in one social ecosystem is a healthier society. So it explains the original purpose of having Varna as a very natural thing.
Let's come back to that common talking point that caste was a European construction. Hindu nationalists like to claim that caste has to be some kind of European construction because caste comes from the word casta in Portuguese. They go on to say that what India had was a more natural, healthy system of Jati and Varna, which they like to claim as the native system of India, a native way to diversify society. Brahmin Hindutva ideologues like Rajiv Malhotra specifically are known for this tactic, where he attempts to divert your attention by using these Sanskrit words in order to appeal to the still prevalent Orientalist views around the East that you still see in the US. It is merely an attempt to rebrand and whitewash the oppressive hierarchical system that is Chaturvarna. It is an attempt to subvert the narrative by co-opting terms of social justice like diversity and inclusion. Crafty guy. So let's take a closer look at Varna. Varna directly translates to the word color. Now, we'd be quick to equate that to mean color of skin. However, this originally did not mean color of skin. It's actually something even worse. Varna refers to the color of a person's gunas, or in English, essential or inherent qualities. The Brahminical belief is that you are born into a certain Varna based on a combination of your gunas and karma. Karma, as you may know, refers to the idea that your actions in this life add up in a karmic tally, which will determine the quality of your next birth, i.e., birth into another Varna in the next life. Now, what's interesting about these ideas is, unlike Abrahamic faiths where you have a book to point to as your religious text, there is no one book in Brahmanism. Brahminical concepts were transmitted through oral traditions and only written down over time by different people. They were formed to suit the specific needs of each ruling class or family at any given time. So they often took on the subjective realities of the various authors who wrote them. This vague situation leads to a lot of hand-waving about the age of many of these texts. For instance, the word Varna itself is surprisingly absent from ancient Vedic texts like the Rig Veda, for instance, which is one of the oldest written works that we have, dated at around 1500 BCE.
1500? Hey, what is this guy saying? He's born yesterday or what? Rig Veda's 50,000 million years old. Who are you?
Indian historian R.S. Sharma even points out that there is no evidence of food or marriage restrictions in the Rig Veda in ancient Vedic communities. Historians and linguists also suggest that there is one verse out of 1,000 hymns in the 10th mandala of the Purusha Sukta that uses a Sanskrit inconsistent with the time. Instead, the Purusha Sukta uses a Sanskrit that is medieval, so 1,000 years younger. What is this controversial passage, this Purusha Sukta? As per the Purusha Sukta of the 10th mandala, the body of the creator, Purush, which translates to man in English, is divided into the mouth, the arms, the thighs, and the feet. In English, this passage says, when they divided Purusha, how many portions did they make? What do they call his mouth? His arms? What do they call his thighs and feet? The Brahmin was his mouth. Of both his arms was the Rajanya made. They didn't have the word Kshatriya yet. His thighs became Vaishya. From his feet, the Shudra was produced. This is the only time in the Rig Veda where these body parts are mentioned, even alluding to any kind of caste system. This is also where we get these 4 Varna rankings. The Manusmriti, which was written around the 3rd or 2nd century BCE, as I mentioned before, also uses these terms in its laws, positing and solidifying the hierarchical structure. We have an interesting account of the social structure in ancient Uttar Pradesh, for instance, through the words of Megasthenes, a Greek writer and an envoy from Arachosia in present-day Afghanistan, who stayed in Chandragupta Maurya's court at the end of the 3rd century BCE, after the Seleucid Mauryan War. According to Raghvi Kanwal's analysis of Megasthenes' work Indica, we get one of the earliest descriptors of social society in Uttar Pradesh through the lens of an outsider. Megasthenes noted 7 castes instead of 4. Even in this 7-tiered system, the philosophers were at the top. They were the only ones called upon to carry out rituals and sacrifices, and would also be the only ones to qualify for privileges like tax exemptions as incentives for good counsel to the king. He also noted that people could not change their castes in Mauryan society. Historians suggest that the general structure that Megasthenes observed was quite consistent with many different structures around the world. But we must also keep in mind that Megasthenes was a Greek supremacist from the Greek imperial core of the time. And the Greeks held a supremacist belief that the subcontinent was actually Greek territory. Because according to their mythology, India was conquered by Dionysus, apparently.
Did I do something to deserve this, man? Because I thought that we were getting on just fine. Better than fine. But this?
He also wrote about how people in India only had culture or any kind of structure at all because the ancient Greeks were the ones who civilized them. This becomes a recurring theme. It should also be noted that Megasthenes stayed in the court of Emperor Chandragupta Maurya and saw society through the eyes of Kautilya or Chanakya, who was one of the most famous Brahmin priests of the time. Coming back to the four Varnas, the story of the Mahabharata is the first instance in writing where we see further discussion of the concept of gunas or essential qualities. There is an attribution of color to each Varna. The guna of Brahmins was seen as white, signifying purity. Kshatriyas were coded as red, signifying power, greed, and pride. Vaishyas were coded as yellow, since they were seen as having a combination of Brahminical and Kshatriya attributes. These three Varnas at the top are known as Dvija, or twice born. The concept of being twice born was not in the original Vedas, not in the Rig Veda. Instead, it comes from the much more recent Manusmriti. Only those who were considered Dvija or twice born were considered pure enough to study the Vedas. At points of time, they were also considered the only ones pure enough to even get educated. The fourth Varna, the Shudra, was coded as having a black guna, the color black denoting locations of low light, dark corners, and a void of spiritual purity. In the Indian context, again, this wasn't really talking about skin color. It differentiated between different tribes based on occupations and geographical locations, and not phenotypical traits. The use of phenotypical traits came with the Greeks. While Brahmin priests would write about how and why certain occupations must be discriminated against to avoid spiritual pollution in order to keep the oppressed in their place, to generate wealth for the temple-centric systems in which they existed, the Greek travelers in India, on the other hand, would hyper-focus on phenotypical traits. They'd write about the Adivasi communities as subhuman with black skin and oversized genitalia. There was this grotesque exoticization of the other in the ancient European world. The lineages of Jatis referred to as Shudra were assigned the task of being servants, born into servitude in order to carry out menial tasks for the rest of society. The children of Shudra parents were locked into their assigned Varna, and it was assumed that their role in life was to serve those considered more holy than they were, in hopes of being born into a privileged caste in the next life. Verse 9, passage 334 and 335 from the Manusmriti say, "For the Shudra, the highest duty conducive to his best welfare is to attend upon such Brahmana householders as are learned in the Vedas and famous. If he is pure, attendant upon his superiors, of gentle speech, free from pride, and always dependent upon the Brahmana, he attains a higher caste."
उसके ब्राह्मणों से मुखमाशी, उसके मुख से ब्राह्मण पैदा हुआ, ठीक है? बाहु राजन्यः, बाहु से क्षत्रिय, ऊरु तदस्य जनवैश्यः, पेट से यहाँ ये जो स्थान है ना, यहाँ से वैश्य पैदा हुआ, पदभ्याम शूद्रो अजायत, पैरों से शूद्र अजायत माने पैदा हुआ, ठीक है? वेद कह रहे, वेद की बात, जो हमारी वेद माता है वही सृष्टि का विधान वही बताती है, ठीक है? तो शास्त्र की दृष्टि से जो देखा जाएगा वही ठीक होगा और कोई ठीक नहीं होगा। मुझे अधिकार नहीं है, वैसे शूद्र को अधिकार नहीं है। हमारे ईश्वर ने बनाया, उसी ने शूद्र बनाया, उसी ने ब्राह्मण बनाया, उसी ने क्षत्रिय बनाया, उसी ने विधान बनाया। उसने कहा कि देखो ये काम इसको करना है, ये काम इसको करना है।
कई ऐसे काम हैं जो हम पढ़कर कर सकते हैं।
ऐसा नहीं, हम ये तो हमारी थ्योरी नहीं है, हमारी कई जन्मों की थ्योरी है। शूद्र जाति मिली क्यों? स्त्री जाति मिली क्यों? काला रंग हुआ क्यों? गोरा रंग हुआ क्यों? ये सब हमारे यहाँ जन्म जन्मांतर के कर्मों का फल है।
Now that's bleak already. So imagine the situation for those considered outside that Varna system. Entire lineages of Jatis who existed outside the Varna system were considered too polluting to even touch. In the case of Kerala, they were considered so polluting that they could not even be seen. They were barred from using main roads because there was a chance that a Brahmin might need to use it to walk to the temple, a chance that a Brahmin might have to gaze upon their bodies. Varna is not the same as class, but as Dr. Ambedkar puts it, it can be understood as an artificially enclosed class, under which thousands of different jatis or lineages are slotted. Class and caste are different but very interconnected concepts. Ignoring caste as an important intersection and only talking about class is like ignoring the intersection of whiteness in America when talking about class. Without a historical understanding or even an acceptance of intentional systems of oppression that set back some communities while catapulting others to immense wealth and power, economic reforms alone will not truly erase inequalities.
Hello, this is Rahul from Mumbai. This man, he doesn't know what he's talking about, yeah? He's full propaganda only, left Marxist propaganda only.
But how did the concepts of Varna, untouchability, and purity based on occupations even come about? Historians suggest that during the Vedic age between 1750 BCE and 500 BCE, the Varna system was still in its embryonic phase and not yet rigid. However, as societies shifted from pastoralism to agriculture, paranoia and fear around the control of newfound territories and the resources that came with them became the new problems for those in power to contend with. Conquest, hunting, and settling also brought about new diseases. Diseases like leprosy, for instance, was much more common in the ancient world and incredibly terrifying. With no answer in sight to cure diseases like leprosy, with medicines proposed by renowned scholars and priests, the ancient world likened the mysterious illness to a form of punishment for the actions of a human being in a previous life or due to some dishonest action in the current one. This was how the primal paranoia of keeping oneself clean and pure came about. The fear of becoming polluted or corrupted by another human being is reflected in every ancient culture we know and is not unique to Hinduism. In ancient Jerusalem as well, people did not really know what to make of a disease like leprosy, attributing it to a curse or a punishment for slander. We know today that 95% of the world is immune to leprosy. But in the void of understanding, we tend to reach for the supernatural even now. In the Torah and the Old Testament, Leviticus 13 to 14, verses 45 and 46 say, "The leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head hang loose. And he shall cover his upper lip, and cry out, 'Unclean, unclean.' 46 says, 'He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp.'" The word jati can be understood as lineage or bloodline. As society stratified over time, kingdoms would assign different work to different jatis. Under the Varna system, every lineage had its specific use, and jatis who were engaged in occupations like hunting, leatherwork, butchery, and dealing with corpses would have been more exposed to dealing with diseases transmitted through bacteria and viruses. The ruling classes were shielded from the labor and toil of the marginalized, but might have noticed that certain diseases may have seemed more prominent or widespread among the working classes and certain occupations, who they already would have found gross because rich people be rich people. That combined with the growing paranoia around ritual purity and how impure elements might impact one's death and rebirth might have led priests to create these stratified systems. To counter ailments and curses that befell society, every religion had some form of ritual cleansing or ritual to appease the gods. This might surprise some of you, but ancient Brahminical texts list out 5 creatures fit for sacrificial slaughter: man, horse, cow, sheep, and goat. Now is a good time to bring awareness to any Eurocentric Orientalist lens you might have on at these historical facts. Unfortunately, it is still common to see people unironically use practices by ancient Orthodox communities to justify slavery and colonialism by Europeans in the present day global south. As we will discuss in further detail later, the British had no interest in bettering Indian society or civilizing it, as the delusion of the white man's burden might suggest, because the goal of the East India Company was to use India like a mine for resources. Like I mentioned before, this was not unique to this part of the world at the time. Sacrifice was prevalent among Germanic, Greek, Roman, Celtic, and other European populations as well. An example of this being the Greek ritual of pharmakos, in which a disabled person, criminal, slave, or anyone deemed outcast by society was thrown off a cliff or burned alive in major cities like Athens to prevent disasters. A more recent example of ritual slaughter in the Western world would be the witch trials in colonial Massachusetts and Europe, which Western chauvinists tend to leave out when talking about the need to civilize cultures of the global south. Remember, no culture or religion is a monolith. Furthermore, the reason why many current day Hindus don't even know about these ancient Vedic sacrifices or might be offended and shocked about them is because the same sacrifices were denounced by prominent voices within their communities themselves and other Indians, not by some mythical European savior. For instance, the later versions of the Satapatha Brahmana themselves denounced the once popular Ashwamedha ritual, the slaughter of horses. Other texts saw a replacement of animal parts with plants, ghee, and so on. And those revisions and rebuttals to older practices were also written by other Brahmins, and not Christian saviors from Europe. And sometime in the 5th century BCE, Buddhism was founded as a direct response to the early Brahminical sacrifices of the Vedic age and the early Varna system that had formed in North India. It was only later in the Hindu epic, the Mahabharata, after Buddhism had become the popular religion, that Brahminical writers spoke about not slaughtering cows. This is something the Hindu nationalists prefer to avoid talking about today or deny, but that's because I think fascists don't like to read. The Brahmin priests, who were seen as pure leaders of ritual and closer to heaven and godhood than any other, had concentrated the power of meaning over generations. However, the reality was they were just the same as anybody else. With the same flaws, there was no difference between a Brahmin and a hunter. Just as the hunter might jealously guard his favorite knife, so did the Brahmin guard his power over society and meaning. In a paranoid world of disease, death, and uncertainty, fueled by wars over resources, people were pushed to stay within the margins drawn around them. Otherwise, those in power felt like they'd lose control and everything would collapse. The marginalized must stay marginalized so that society may continue to function, or such was the reason. Therefore, it is advantageous for such an immoral, cruel society if some people did not marry outside their communities, and if literacy and the ability to read and write were guarded. As with patriarchal systems in all our histories that necessitate the control of purity of blood and possession of land and generational wealth, women from all castes were subject to marginalization. This is the material and historical background that one must keep in mind when looking at a text like the Manusmriti. The text was a compilation of codes of law said to have been written by a king called Manu. They were originally taught from Brahmin teacher to Brahmin student via oral tradition, the word Smriti literally meaning what is heard. It was one of the many legal texts of the Dharma Shastras. In her critical analysis of the Manusmriti, Satarupa Sarkar mentions that there are massive inconsistencies, like how in earlier verses 3.55 to 3.62 seem to glorify the role of women, but the later verses of 9.3 to 9.17 do the exact opposite. Those later sections today read like an incel's code of law. It is stated in these later sections that all women, regardless of who they were born to, were Shudra, as part of the lowest ranking Varna. No wonder Dr. Ambedkar burnt it. We have to keep this in mind when current day Hindu nationalists like Rajiv Malhotra spread misinformation to whitewash how the Varna system entangles the Jatis of the land. Instead of sympathizing with the struggles that come about as a result of this hierarchical system, many like him in positions of privilege condemn any critical discussion about Varna and play it off as some kind of anti-Hindu conspiracy. Now that we have a better understanding of Jati and Varna, let's go back to 8th century Kerala. Chinese traders who were familiar with the region north of ancient Kerala noted a widespread segregation of society based on the Chaturvarna system. This contrasts with what many Chinese traders of the time observed in Kerala earlier. In Kerala, travelers from ancient Greece, Arabia, and China often wrote about the diversity of the land and even the existence of fair-skinned Jain communities from the north, darker-skinned natives, and even intermarriages between all these communities. The second coming of Chera dominance in the region came with the ascendancy of the Kulasekhara Cheras, a line of Chera kings descended from Kongunad Vellalars. The Vellala communities shared marriage ties with empires like the Chola and were and are a prosperous landowning caste in South India. The new Cheras established Mahodayapuram in modern-day Kodungalur as their new capital. With them, they brought from the north the new cult of Vaishnavites and lots of Brahmin priests. During this time period, from the 8th to the 11th century CE, historians and archaeologists note a significant increase in Brahmin-only settlements, also known as agraharams. Hundreds of families would live in segregated villages where only Brahmins could walk in or around. These settlements were usually set up along arable lands and rivers, perfect for the activity of rice farming. This period would mark a beginning of the rapid Sanskritization and Brahminization of the people of Kerala. The rise of temple-centric religious culture under Brahminism in the Deccan kingdoms of ancient Karnataka had now spread to Kerala and popularized among the ruling classes. The 8th century saw the birth and life of Adi Shankara, who was an incredibly influential Namboodiri Brahmin, who co-opted the ideas of Buddhism to create his own Advaita Vedanta, essentially an orthodox school of Brahmanism. In fact, the influences of Buddhism were so obvious that other Brahmins from Tamil Nadu later criticized Adi Shankara for being a crypto-Buddhist. Advaita Vedanta is a non-dualistic school of Brahmanism that proposed the supremacy of the Vedas, including more recent works like the Manusmriti. He believed that Brahman, the creator god, not to be confused with Brahmin, was everywhere in everything. It proposed that humans were also Brahman. Adi Shankara would travel far and wide debating Buddhist and Jain scholars in order to argue his case for the Brahminical worldview. Debates were incredibly popular in all parts of ancient India, and it's very easy to find accounts of kingdoms who prided themselves on debate culture. But as we know from even today's debate culture on the internet, they're not always constructive. It's more entertainment and blood sport than anything. Although this new line of Vaishnavite Chera kings left inscriptions explicitly calling for religious tolerance, it doesn't seem to have been enough to keep the Buddhist traditions alive, and might have been indicative of tensions that had been brewing between the Buddhists and the Brahminical fold. The Buddhists, who had intertwined themselves with the tribal culture of Kerala, posed a problem for the Brahminical Advaita Vedanta Bhakti movement. In order for various chieftains and kings of the time to achieve a higher status, they saw that attaining the approval of the priestly class of Brahmins was the way to go. Many ancient temples that are considered as Hindu today used to be Buddhist viharas and Jain temples. Archaeologists regularly fish out broken statues of the Buddha from lakes and ponds. In some cases, statues had been carved into lingams or other structures and worshipped as yakshi or a type of forest spirit. According to the Namboodiri Brahmins, the land of Kerala was a land of snakes and demons, referring to the indigenous gods and people as beneath them and subhuman. Therefore, in Kerala, everyone who wasn't a Brahmin was considered Shudra and untouchable, all impure according to Brahmanism. They even viewed the existing Chera chieftains as impure and untouchable as well, and not true Kshatriya, which was very different from the case of North India. All the inhabitants were considered an Aryan, an Avarna. So how did the Namboodiri Brahmin community exert their influence over the land, over a population they believed to be so polluting and disgusting? Allow me to introduce you to the Hiranyagarbha ceremony. This was a Vedic ritual that allowed a king to upgrade their Varna status in exchange for their weight in gold. The Namboodiri Brahmins would order for the construction of a gold statue of a bell or a bull, inside of which the king or chieftain would be required to sit. After the ritual was complete, the king would emerge from the construct and become Kshatriya, a twice born. Actually, Samandan Kshatriya, the Sanskrit term for Kshatriya adjacent, not really Kshatriya, since their lineage technically was outside the Varna system still. After this ritual, some of these kings would then be able to be in the same room as the Brahmin priests and have a meal with them. They still could not touch physically, but they could be in the same room. This is why only a fraction of the Nair population at the time were considered Samandan Kshatriya, linked to the bloodlines of chiefs and kings. The Kiryadil Nair population, meaning crown Nair in Malayalam, and Iladu Nair were examples of privileged caste Nair populations who benefited from Hiranyagarbha rituals and colluding with Brahminical landlords. The Zamarin of Calicut shared a similar status to the Kiryadil Nair. The rest of the Nair communities would share a similar status to landless tenants who had a slightly higher social position as the Erava. This table illustrates some of the traditional occupations of these Nair, and you can see here how class operates within caste as well. This is why I can't help but cringe when people online try to monolithize Nairs and other communities into a homogeneous group who are all equally guilty of some kind of caste-based atrocity or violence. It's simply not true, and unfortunately also an indication of our lack of attention to nuance as a community, and shows how hypocritical we can be in jumping to simplify someone else's identity and invalidating their work based on the community they may have been born into with no decision of their own. The now dominant Namboodiri Brahmin community dictated social norms. Sanskrit, the language of the Vedas, was only taught to the Brahmins, and even within the Brahmin families, only the eldest Brahmin son was allowed to learn certain Sanskrit chants. Since the new Cheras had bought into the supremacy of the Brahmins, they forfeit their lands to the temples. The lands of the people were also forfeit, and Kerala became what is known as the Devaswam, meaning God's land. The vast swaths of cultivable lands for paddy now belonged to the Brahmin temples. The Chera kings allowed for the assembly of temple committees, which function like agrarian corporations, managed by a council of Urilar of Namboodiri Brahmin priests. However, these corporations also enjoyed political autonomy and could take part in local administration. These committees also acted as accountants and were in charge of temple revenue. They served as an agency for more efficient extraction of surplus from the population. It also contributed to the extension of agriculture to tribal lands and the consolidation of landlord domination. The temples also belonged to the Namboodiri Brahmins, and the common person was not allowed to enter them, even though they were built by marginalized people. From this union of corporations masquerading as religious entities, political power and land was concentrated in the hands of a sliver of the population. In 100 years of war, due to the expansionist strategies of the Chola Empire and one Rajaraja Chola, just made everything worse. Chola armies would annex parts of Kerala like Palakkad and Thiruvananthapuram. This period saw the influx of Tamil Brahmins as well from the Chola Empire in multiple waves throughout the centuries. The Tamil Brahmins set up their own temple-centric systems and agraharams and did not cooperate with the Namboodiri Brahmins. Despite the numerous setbacks and defeats that the Chera chieftains suffered at the hands of the Chola invaders, the Cholas were ultimately unable to hold hegemonic power over Kerala. The last Chera king, Ramavarma Kulasekhara, transformed large swaths of his army into suicide squads in a desperate last-ditch attempt to remove the Cholas from Kerala. The Cholas under Kulathanga Chola were defeated and forced to withdraw to the south, which marked the end of Chola occupation in Kerala. The Cheras were severely weakened during this phase, and vassals like prominent Nair chieftains saw an opportunity, and Ramavarma abdicated the throne, essentially marking the end of the Cheras. This only further strengthened the control of the Namboodiri Brahmin patriarchs, as many chiefs and warriors who had died during the suicide war had given over their lands to the temples. The Cholas heavily taxed their occupied territories to keep the war machine going, and to avoid taxation, many chieftains had given over their lands to temples because temples did not need to pay taxes. Over the centuries, as society stratified even further under this Namboodiri system of control, the land went from being known as Devaswam to Brahmaswam, the land of the Brahmins. And what if the common person? What happened to you if you weren't a king or a chieftain? An alliance was formed between the Brahmin oligarchs and the local chieftains, the ones who had been newly converted. Purified and upgraded in caste status, against the tenants and serfs whom they controlled and exploited. They were considered untouchable, unseeable, and landless slaves from birth. The distinctive duty of the Shudra is to serve the Brahmin. Everything else that he does is fruitless for him. Chapter 12 of the Brahminical text Gautama Dharma Sutras states that if a Shudra listens intentionally to the Veda, his ears shall be filled with molten tin or lac. If he recites the Vedas, his tongue shall be cut out. If he remembers them, his body shall be split in twain. If a Shudra mentions the name and caste of any twice-born men with scorn, a burning iron nail 10 inches long shall be thrust into his mouth. Sociologist Prema Kurian wrote in her paper on ethnogenesis and colonialism that this Aryanization also entailed in the gradual stripping away of rights of women. As we'd mentioned before when talking about the Manusmriti, all women, regardless of their birth, were considered Shudra within the old systems of Kerala. And since the common person was not allowed to hear or read the Vedas, the temples would arrange performances while co-opting local traditions like Kood, a form of storytelling through dance. These performances became a way for Namboodiri Brahmins to use a familiar trope in order to propagate their own versions of the oral traditions to the marginalized communities. And through these performances, Dravidian gods were slowly but surely co-opted into Vedic ones. For instance, the origin of the land of Kerala itself began to take on a Brahminical form early on in oral traditions. And this is what eventually culminated in the 17th century work of Keralolpati. This gave the ruling classes a foundational myth, a religious story that justified them being at the top as the rightful owners of the land, while they kept the tenants and serfs divided. In Dilip Menon's paper, thus was born the tale of Parashurama, the sixth avatar of the Vedic Aryan god Vishnu. In this tale, Vishnu, in the form of Parashurama, goes on a killing spree, punishing numerous generations of Kshatriya warriors and kings, all for insulting his father. Tired and remorseful for his excessive violence, he sought the advice of Brahmin sages. They advised him to fling his bloody axe into the sea, and where his axe fell arose a narrow strip of land that we now call Kerala. However, when the land came up, it was filled with poisonous snakes and demons, referring to the snake worship of the Nairs. Another legend, most likely propagated by privileged caste Nairs, speaks of Nairs having taken off their sacred threads to hide in the lands of Kerala to avoid Parashurama killing them for being Kshatriya. This is most likely an attempt to call to a Kshatriya past which you tend to see all over South India. The myth claims indigeneity for the Brahmins. Parashurama then settled the Brahmins on the land. It was his gift to the Brahmins in atonement. The story goes that the Brahmins then developed it, and then all the other castes followed from everywhere else. This myth claims indigeneity for the Brahmins to justify the right to the land, while dehumanizing people who already existed as snakes and demons. Sound familiar? It's also interesting that a similar myth around an older Chera king already existed, where the king throws a spear into the sea to call upon his capital. They couldn't have just appropriated that too now, could they? Writer Ajay Shekhar wrote on the transformation of the tradition of Onam. Maveli or Mahabali was known in subaltern myths as a benevolent king who exemplified egalitarian values. The Brahminical story that erased the tales and deeds of Mahabali claimed that the god Vishnu had to appear once more in the form of the dwarf Vamana, one of the many avatars of Vishnu. In the story, Vamana is known to have turned Mahabali's generosity against him. Vamana asked Mahabali to give him 3 steps of land. Mahabali agreed, happy to fulfill the request. But at that moment, Vamana pulls a fast one and grows in size. The story goes that he became so large that his footstep covered the entire earth. The second step covered the entire sky. And since there was no place left for his third step, Mahabali, being the generous king that he was, offered up his own head to be stepped on. Upon stepping on his head, Mahabali was banished to the netherworld. The symbolism within this myth about the superiority of the Aryan Brahmin Vamana over the so-called Asura demon king Mahabali should not be lost on you. It certainly wasn't lost on Amit Shah and other BJP fascists. People resisted in ways they could. The Dravidian art form of Theyyam, which Indians outside Kerala might mistake for a Hindu ritual, was born from Dravidian ancestor worship. Theyyam signifies rage directly at the caste system. There's a reason why Theyyam performers are all from marginalized castes, like the Puliyan, Vanan, Malayan, Velan and Mavilan communities. Theyyam is a form of remembering the human beings martyred through caste-based violence. And it doesn't even restrict itself to telling the stories only of those marginalized castes. It also tells the stories of privileged caste people who transgressed against their community's own rules and pay dearly for it, whether by ostracization or death. In a Theyyam ritual, a performer would allow themselves to be possessed by the spirit of the martyred ancestor, who'd be deified and given a godlike status. This godlike status would give the performer a brief moment in which they would transcend the caste hierarchy and see themselves as above the privileged castes. Theyyam is an overtly political art form, and Pottan Theyyam is arguably the most political of them all. In Pottan Theyyam, Pottan directly challenges Adi Shankara, the Brahmin Acharya of Advaita. Pottan walks the main road while carrying a child on his waist and a pot of toddy on his head until he runs into the Brahmin Acharya. To avoid distance pollution, Adi Shankara asks Pottan to get off the main road so he can walk by. In the story, Pottan retorts by asking why he should do such a thing. He goes on a rage-filled rant against the caste system and questions the hypocrisy of Advaita Vedanta's non-dualistic idea itself. As I mentioned before, Shankara proposed that Brahma or God existed in everyone and not as a separate entity somewhere far off in the skies. God was man and man was God. However, when Adi Shankara said man, he meant just Brahmin. It was like equality only for Brahmins. In the Theyyam, Pottan says, "You smear the sandal paste, we are bathed in dirt. You wear chains of gold, we wear the chain of fish. Haven't you crossed the river in which the canoe I rode? The banana grown in our dump yard is the offering to your God. The basil grown in our dump yard is the garland of your God. Still, why do you argue over caste? When you are wounded, is it not blood that gushes out? When I too am wounded, is it not blood?" In the story and performance, Adi Shankara eventually realizes his mistake and apologizes. He prostrates himself and seeks forgiveness. However, the reality is that The event that this Theyyam portrays most likely ended with the killing of the Dalit character. That's why it's a Theyyam. The hundreds of Theyyams sprinkled throughout the landscape of Kerala are regional and are not performed outside their region because someone of that region was martyred through caste-based violence. Theyyam became a means for Dalits to express a form of agency and to reject a system which no one asked for. Later on, when Marxism would become a popular ideology for the Erava community, Theyyam would go on to be a mainstay fixture in communist rallies and agitation against the landlord castes, in a seemingly paradoxical union of communist and religious forces, which honestly allows for its own set of counter-revolutionary situations, but we'll touch on that another time. And as history tends to repeat itself, Theyyams are now being slowly Brahminized by the RSS. For instance, in the example of Palandai Kannan, an Erava martyr deity who has been Sanskritized into Vishnumurti, another avatar of Vishnu who devoured the demon Hiranyakshapu, essentially erasing the martyr's past. And rather tragically, in the modern Sanskritized version of the Pottan Theyyam, the Dalit Pottan disappears and is replaced by Shiva. Why? Because our inherent casteism cannot accept that a Brahmanacharya would bow to a Dalit. This is how it works. In the land tenure system of the Namboodiri Brahmins, they established a bondage system in which families would be attached to packets of land in order to ensure a permanency of labor. Even though the Brahmins owned the land through divine right, they could not physically supervise the farmers and the tenants because of untouchability laws, so they were absent landlords. Instead, martial castes like the Nairs, who were also previously considered Shudra and untouchable, were settled on the arable lands owned by the temples in order to play middle manager and supervisor. They oppressed the tenant and serf castes on behalf of the Brahmins. The Brahmins controlled Nair communities by exploiting the Nair cultural tradition of matrilineal property transfer. It was a system where Nair lands could only be transferred through the matriarch of the family. The Brahmins established a system of false marriages called Sambandham, a system in which the younger sons of the Brahmin families would marry Nair women in order to keep hold of the property. What's tragic was any children that they would have to be treated as untouchable by the Brahmin father. The father was not obligated to be involved in the rearing of the child at all. The Nair woman was also entitled to refuse or even end the relationship. But over time, the other men and women in the Nair households would come to look down upon this as a social taboo, and any refusal to accept a Sambandha marriage would be seen as the family taking a hit to their social status. It was also not uncommon for younger Brahmin children to be outcast from their communities and deemed impure by their own families. The older sons of the Namboodiri Brahmin communities, though, they were the only ones allowed to marry a Namboodiri Brahmin woman. And they were the only ones also allowed to learn certain Sanskrit shlokas and perform certain rituals. This unique, highly restrictive system allowed families to concentrate ritual and material wealth and power, even more so than probably any other place in India. Namboodiri Brahmins of pure birth, not just any Namboodiri Brahmin, also were exempt from paying taxes. How did the Muslims and Christians of this era operate? If one were to look at the situation in India today, which is honestly seen through a very North Indian lens, you might make the assumption that there was tension between the Hindus, Muslims, and Christians. However, that wasn't the case earlier on. Hindus as a homogeneous group just didn't exist yet. And in the case of Kerala, Christians and Muslims were considered to be outside the Varna system. But since there was no traditional Vaishya caste or merchant caste, affluent Christians and Muslims filled that gap. Their material wealth and status at the time was beneficial for the Brahmins to co-opt into their system. Sonia Thomas of the Syrian Christian community has written a great dissertation on the Syrian Christian histories. Check it out if you're interested. The early Christian communities known as the Nazranis were part of the Eastern Church. They developed an interesting relationship with the Namboodiri Brahmin community over time. The Nazrani communities were and still are a highly endogamous community. They barely marry outside their communities. Being a merchant community outside the Varna system who already owned land before the Brahminical hegemony got there, they were allowed to continue to operate on the condition that they accepted Brahminical hegemony. So Nazranis became known as purifiers. Purifiers of what, you might ask? Purifiers of the polluting aspects of marginalized castes. For instance, oil is an integral part of temple culture in Kerala. However, according to old Manu, the lawgiver, pressing of oil was considered a base occupation, a highly polluting one. Yeah, the guy really seemed to pull shit out of his ass. The caste engaged with pressing oil at the time was the Vanian community, and certain Nair castes as well. And as per the norms of medieval Kerala, oil pressing was considered impure. But the Syrian Christian priest's touch was considered to be a purifier, causing the pollution to be null and void. Over time, this symbiotic relationship with the Brahmin community and this upliftment in status because of their closeness to them would also get the Nazranis to start practicing untouchability. The community had established an equal status to that of privileged caste landowning Nairs. They were awarded lands by the Namboodiris and even traded lands with them, and these lands would have permanent Adiyan families or slave families attached to them. In a caste stratified society, communities tend to want to identify with those in power. We haven't changed much, and we see this even today, in which some affluent families of minority communities, in the US for instance, struggle with trying to attain whiteness when they exist within the white supremacist hierarchy. Namboodiri Brahmin men would also marry Syriac Christian women and have a similar arrangement to what they had with the Nair community in order to control the land. Those who stepped out of line by marrying someone outside their caste tended to face social consequences. This is very, very different from other Christian groups in Kerala, like the Latin Catholic communities or the Protestant communities that arose from Portuguese and then later British missionary work. Those Christian groups tend to be the most exogamous in all of Kerala, with marriage patterns not being as restrictive. Case in point, and just like those myths that claim to be Kshatriya from the Nair community, popular legends began to circulate among the Syriac Christians, claiming that their ancestors were actually Namboodiri Brahmins also, who were converted by the Apostle Thomas himself. This allowed the elite within the community to claim a higher status via being associated with Namboodiri Brahmins, which doesn't really make sense because the Nazrani Christians had already established themselves before Brahminical hegemony was even a thing. As for the Muslim community who had established themselves from the 6th century onwards, between the 6th and the 15th centuries, religious violence was non-existent because again, they fit into the Brahminical system at the time. There are numerous papers and historical research that document this, but I will be using a very recent one from 2022 by Shana and Jodharmani for a bulk of this section. Calicut in northern Kerala was an incredible trading hub, serviced mainly by Arab ships. Many Arab traders had lived in Kerala for centuries and settled down, initially with the support of local chieftains and later with the support of Namboodiri Brahmins. To the privileged castes, the seafaring skill of the Arabs was seen as useful, as the belief among the Namboodiri Brahmins at the time was that the sea was a resting place for the gods and must not be disturbed with them traveling on it. According to the ancient Brahmin priest Bodhyana, who wrote the Bodhyana Sutras, a Brahmin would lose his caste for traveling over the sea. Because of this, the Namboodiri Brahmins again formed a symbiotic relationship with the early Muslim traders when they were affluent. They were even patrons of mosques built at the time. The Samudri of Calicut, or as the Portuguese and Dutch called them, the Zamorin of Calicut, was a local chieftain whose own ancestors had gone through the Hiranyagarbha ceremony in order to achieve a Kshatriya adjacent status. The Zamorin would handle coastal trade and was very successful. Indigenous fisherfolk who were not Muslim but considered outside the caste system and not Hindu either would seek employment on the docks to escape the slavery and forced labor they would have to endure from the Brahmin landlords. They'd become sailors and many would convert to Islam and become part of the storied Marakkar merchants who dominated sea trade at the time. Privileged caste groups did not see any issue with conversion at the time because, again, there was no electoral politics and they did not have the need to keep a homogeneous Hindu voting bloc. Today, the RSS promotes these fascist ideas of a Hindu genocide, a narrative that mirrors the white genocide myths peddled by American white supremacists and evangelical Christians. Privileged castes at the time were more interested in one's bloodline and purity than one's religion. I have to say that because RSS shakas in Kerala today are working really hard to try and cover up this symbiotic relationship between the Hindus and Muslims in the past. Because Kerala today still doesn't have the vitriolic violence between Hindus and Muslims that you might see in other states. The inconvenient truth that the Hindutva fascists want to hide is that life for the marginalized under Brahminical patriarchy was brutal by law. I mean, if you could be killed for merely walking on a main road, then why not take your chances as a shipwright, where you can actually earn some money? Being a sailor sounds pretty fun. We even have medieval ballads called Mappila, which sing of prominent Muslims seeing no difference between the Erava and the Nair castes. And it wasn't just marginalized castes who saw the benefit of sea trading and becoming a Marakkar. Excommunicated Nairs and Namboodiri Brahmins would also seek work from Muslim traders. And many of those privileged caste members would also convert to Islam. The Mappila Muslims, unlike pretty much, I guess, anywhere else in the world, also followed a matrilineal property sharing system. A matrilineal tradition of wealth transfer, like the Nair communities. The matriarch of the household would handle finances, and that would pass on to the next matriarch. Economics forced the Brahmins to accept the Muslim community into their system. This all changed, however, once the Portuguese set foot on Kerala, looking for the storied lost Christians. I'll keep this section a little bit brief so I can circle back to Muslims. The Portuguese found the lost Christians in the Nazranis, but they didn't like what they found. The Portuguese attempted to forcefully convert the Syriac Christians to come under the Roman Catholic Pope. However, the Syrian Christians did not want to leave the Eastern Church of Assyria, which triggered an inquisition. The Portuguese were especially brutal, and during their time, they set up training posts all along the coast of Kerala and began directly competing with the Muslim community. In typical colonial fashion, they even began to resort to violence in order to more efficiently monopolize trade in the region. The Mappila Muslim community was ethnically cleansed and driven inland. This cut off entire communities from their traditional source of wealth and trade. This exodus of Mappila Muslims at the hands of the Portuguese is barely covered. The Arab traders packed up and left, and the now landless Muslims were forced to move inland and rebuild. According to Prema Kurian, the formation of Mappila Muslims that we know today as a distinct ethnic community really began after this ethnic cleansing. They had to face the struggle of re-establishing themselves in a brutal caste hierarchy, where your social status and lineage literally decided if you lived or died. Most of the community had to shift from being merchants to being landless laborers for privileged caste landlords. And it wasn't just the privileged caste rulers of the area that took advantage of the situation. The 1750s to the 1790s saw multiple invasions by the Mysorean kingdom from the north, led by the Muslim kings Hyder Ali and later by his son Tipu Sultan. One of the main objectives of Mysore was to take control of Travancore's vastly influential trading ports. And as you would have figured out, they weren't the only ones eyeing that region. Because after the Portuguese had conquered and controlled it, the Dutch took it off their hands, and then the Mysore kings, and then the British. The Mysore kings saw a unique opportunity in the disenfranchised Mappila Muslims who stood at odds with the local landlords and kings. The Mysore occupation used their power and influence to deepen the divide between the Mappila Muslims and the local non-Muslim populations, just as the British would go on to do later. and just like how the BJP and RSS are doing today. The common thread between them all, of course, is power and control, divide and conquer. As the Mysore kingdoms conquered parts of Kerala, they would appoint local Mappila people who they trusted as the new landlords in order to govern the areas on behalf of Mysore. This new landlord class began to organize themselves with the Thangals as their leaders. The Thangals were essentially a subgroup of Muslims adjacent with the Sayyids of the north and in Pakistan, who believed themselves to be the direct descendants of the Prophet, and they saw themselves adjacent in social status to Brahmins. It was during this time that the Mappila Muslim community began to adopt certain styles of dress and take on systems of Muslim populations from North India, leaving behind indigenous traditions like matrilineal property share and so on. The invaders from Mysore had flipped the balance of power and turned the social structures on their heads in the areas. But when the British arrived on the scene, the British allied themselves with the privileged caste traditional landowners and worked with the families to take back the land. The British, like other colonial powers, did not really care much for the social harmony or progression of the native population and had already been implementing zamindari systems across India in their territories. And just like that, the lands in northern Kerala switched hands back to the Brahmin landlord. Generations of humiliation. Like the case of untouchability in India, it was hereditary. And just like many other caste-based societies around the world, a marginalized life was discrimination. The new Kozeki system of citizenship registry detailed your entire family history and occupations. This was also seen in Rwanda when it was under colonial occupation, where it was easy for Hutus and Tutsis to identify someone else's background. What do you think bigots are going to do with that information? The new title given to Japan's untouchables was Shin Haimin, meaning new commoners. How was that not a dead giveaway? Furthermore, any employer or marriage seeker would be able to view which geographical location you lived in or came from, which is exactly how people in India try to find out what your caste is. Indians are very used to questions like, where's your family from? What do they do? What is your last name? Which street are you from? All these questions are used to guess at one's caste status, so the asker can decide on whether or not to treat you with respect or scorn. This is the kind of lunacy one must employ when you don't have the benefit of skin tone to discriminate with. It took until 2016 for Japan to even implement a law against Burakumin discrimination. For perspective, untouchability in India was outlawed in 1950, and it hasn't solved it. The biblical justification for the European slave trade as well employed a type of hereditary status, a hereditary form of discrimination. Some of you may be familiar with the story in the book of Genesis. Noah cursed the children of his son Ham into eternal slavery for looking upon his drunken naked body. Now, the story never really mentioned skin color, but that didn't stop European colonialists from using it to justify their anti-blackness. Speaking of which, when the British took over Kerala, the caste system underwent major changes between 1850 and 1947. This was an unintended side effect as the British transformed the landscape of India and Kerala to fit their plans of capital extraction. They were incentivized to create an educated class of clerks to oversee operations and keep the colonial machinery going. And British Protestant missionaries also began to set up schools. And for the first time in generations, for many bloodlines, this opened up the prospect of education for many castes who had been previously banned from it. Prominent members of communities like the Erava and the Pulia, who were the largest of the formerly untouchable groups, now had access to some form of education. The Brahmins and Nairs as well were deprived of their traditional role of supervisor and landowner. And many Brahminical features of caste, like the Sambandham marriages, were abolished in favor of the idea of a nuclear family, a Victorian concept, and land ownership switched over to individuals rather than the joint family. Besides those who were active participants in the colonial machinery, there were also many among the British missionaries who sympathized with the plight of the untouchables in Kerala. Whatever the intentions were, the rapid social changes in the 19th century gave the marginalized people of Kerala the wedge they needed to challenge the pre-existing Brahminical hegemony. The British needed to decide on how and whom to tax in India and what kind of laws they should be implementing within society. But instead of actually trying to understand the complex dynamics of the country and the generational effects of caste-based segregation and apartheid, they chose the path of dividing the country based on religious identities instead, because it would be much more efficient. The Muslims and the Christians had a holy text that the British could use to devise laws around. However, the other groups within India did not have a single religious text. They had vastly different food habits, different languages, cultures, ways of dressing, even gods. So the colonial government chose to group them all together under a racial term they used to designate natives who were not Muslim as Hindu. So now vast swaths of people were grouped under religion and they didn't even realize it. Originally, this grouping included Jains, Sikhs, and Buddhists as well. And the texts they used to artificially group everyone together were that of the Brahminical Dharma Shastras. Remember, these texts were compiled by Brahmins, written by Brahmins, and for a very long period of history could only be read by Brahmins. So why did the British do this anyway? There are many answers to this besides what I mentioned before, being ease. But it's worth remembering also that in the 18th and 19th centuries, colonial projects around the world were obsessed with race. 1859 was the year Charles Darwin dropped his book, The Origin of Species. This is what Mark Brown of the University of Melbourne wrote in 2001 in his paper on the construction of native criminality in India. He wrote that the idea of evolution itself provided the heuristic key that race theory had to that point been lacking. Suddenly, the practical significance of race had become apparent. If humankind had evolved in a process of progressively more successful adaptations, race could explain the progress of civilization and thus of forms of social organization, political consciousness, and government. Different races with their differing levels of civilization and social organization now could be understood to fall on a scientifically grounded continuum of human development. In short, eugenics. From the perspective of colonial Britain, Darwin's theory of evolution had opened up the whole world as a laboratory for the examination of human origins, but more importantly to the British power, an insight into the justification of Britain's actions and their own rise through history. Rather than focusing on the ethnologies and hierarchies back home in Britain, the colonies became the focal point where the inferior races could be found for scientific research. In 1866, the governor of Bengal, George Campbell, had this to say at a meeting of the Asiatic Society of Bengal.
It is now evident that as this country, in a far greater degree than any other in the world, offers an unlimited field for ethnological observation and inquiry, and presents an infinity of varieties of almost every one of the great divisions of the human race, so also there is no lack of able and qualified men to reap this abundant harvest.
You know that system of using your fingerprint as identification? This is where it was developed. It was first used by the British administration in Bengal in the 19th century. Sir William Herschel, the chief magistrate of Hooghly district in Yungipur, first used it for contract signatures and later for the criminal justice system. If you've watched my video on the erasure of trans people in colonial India, you're familiar with the Criminal Tribes Act, an act which deemed entire caste groups criminal from birth. To the British, India was essentially a mine for resources, a place that London could leech off of to fuel its own industrialization. They didn't care for social reform because they weren't planning a settler colony like Israel. They just wanted our resources. So who could manage local affairs and help British officials understand the landscape? Why, the people whom the British were already in contact with. Kings, royalty, priests, the privileged castes. The Nigerian post-colonial scholar and Pan-Africanist Chinwe Zhu gives us the best explanation of this phenomenon in his book Decolonizing the African Mind. Chinwe Zhu uses the characters from Shakespeare's play The Tempest. Prospero, a wizard and the ousted Duke of Milan, takes on the role of the European colonizer, and his two servants, Ariel and Caliban, represent the two types of native identities that arise from colonialism. Caliban is represented as less than human, always seeking to rebel and struggle for freedom. He is forced into subjugation, and Prospero takes it upon himself to civilize him. Ariel, on the other hand, is seen as the good native, a magical character willing to serve Prospero in exchange for freedom and prosperity in the future. He is willing to oppress Caliban on behalf of Prospero. The experience of colonialism is never an equal one. The British saw no issue with the caste system because it neatly tied in to their understanding of race science, centered around white supremacy. This picture of a punkawala should tell you all you need to know about what the British thought about the marginalized people of India. Punkah were ceiling fans that were manually operated by a marginalized caste person in order to keep British officers cool as they slept or took a nap. The British lived up to the white supremacist traditions rooted in Greek culture, a culture they claimed heritage to, by viewing human beings who didn't look like them as living property. And they saw the privileged caste Hindus and the privileged caste Muslims being at the top as just a simple form of evolution. They saw it as the natural progress of society. This is why they would view the privileged castes as the good and valuable native who fit the role of middle manager to help in the project of capital extraction. The British and the privileged castes of the time viewed the marginalized as subhuman. The British solidified the grip of caste even further because it was convenient for them. Let me take a quick sidebar here. The underlying reason for partition of India and Pakistan, for instance, was because of the squabbles of the privileged caste Muslims and privileged caste Hindus. The reality was most of India's Muslims at the time did not want partition. And if you look at the Muslim population today in India, they are severely underrepresented in government, in managerial positions, and even education. This caste intersection, combined with the hateful Muslim rhetoric and a lack of access to education, leaves India's Muslims in a very precarious situation as one of the most marginalized communities in India today. Clearly, the British viewed the new Hindu bloc through the eyes of Brahmin advisors. This was reflected in the implementation of laws like the Hindu Widow Remarriage Act. The British didn't care to understand that there were actually massive cultural distinctions between the new Hindu population, between Brahmin households and non-Brahmin ones. Widow remarriage was common among marginalized caste communities. However, in Brahminical communities, where the law was the Manusmriti, widow remarriage was forbidden. Because remember, the reason why women were forbidden from remarrying in privileged caste communities was in order to control their bodies and maintain caste purity. Controlling caste purity meant controlling the family wealth. This wasn't the case amongst the marginalized. And this is clear to see in the compromises that the British made in order to appease the orthodox elements within the privileged caste societies. They agreed that women should have the right to remarry on the condition that she give up any property under her name. Around the same time, Europeans who had been studying Sanskrit texts discovered a link between Sanskrit and other European languages. This led to the theory that Europeans and privileged caste Indians shared common ancestors, whom they called Aryans. The colonial government was happy to use this new term as a tool, claiming that, hey, look, we're related, so me dominating you is not so bad. We're just trying to help. This is why some privileged caste supremacists tend to believe that they're European or want to be European or idolize European fascists. Some reformers among the privileged caste did not even want to be called Hindu. Instead, they wanted to be called Aryas in order to distance themselves from the other Hindus because status and brain rot are two peas in a pod. I say all this to simplify my point, but don't forget that popular fronts made up of privileged caste and marginalized caste people alike led our anti-colonial struggle against the British and their collaborators. So remember to not monolithize all privileged caste people as inherently evil or some idiotic thing like that. That's simply counterproductive, and be wary of anyone who tells you to do that, because chances are they might be peddling some other form of ethno-linguistic nationalism. This is just how power worked when the objective was to control capital, a common objective of affluent privileged caste communities and the colonialists of the time. Until the British implemented the caste census in its various territories, no one really understood just how unequal Indian society was. The British chose to push caste talk into the background and focus on the binary religious one, which is why we still talk of India as a Hindu-Muslim binary. Any talk about caste today gets people yelling at you about trying to divide the Hindus, as if Hindus were a homogeneous, unthinking monolith. It's no different really than how Zionists hide behind Judaism and Jewish people and try to conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. Fascist ideologies are quick to devour its own children and shift seemingly puritanical goals if it meant furthering their genocidal ideas. The caste census of the 1900s had raised the social awareness of the masses, and privileged caste groups realized that majority of the country were made up of Bahujan or OBC and Dalit communities. And if they didn't quickly co-opt them as Hindu as well, they would quickly become a political minority.
1936 was the year when Ambedkar published The Annihilation of Caste. It was I think in 1935 that he first called on the untouchable population, which was about 44 million people at that time, to give up Hinduism and to embrace any other religion. This, at that moment, came as a terribly dangerous sign to what were the Hindu reformers, and I'll explain why. You know, until the turn of the century, there wasn't such a thing, such an idea as Hindu. People who today are called Hindus or who call themselves Hindus never did call themselves Hindus. They only refer to themselves as their caste. You know, they would say, I'm a Brahmin, I'm a Jadhav, I'm a Gujjar. And earlier on, during the Mughal reign, millions of untouchables had converted to Islam, later to Christianity, and later to Sikhism to escape the scourge of caste. And nobody had a problem with that. But at the turn of the century, suddenly the politics of empire began to turn into the politics of the nation state. And suddenly, you know, it was not enough to just ride your horse or your elephant into Delhi and take the throne and declare yourself the emperor. So with the nation state came the politics of representation. So many religions, 3,000 languages, all of this was kind of now being synthetically homogenized into a nation state. Who has the right to say, I represent everybody? You know, who represents the big farmers, who represents the labor, who represents the Sikhs? Who can say who represents whom? And at this point, suddenly the idea that 44 million people under the accounting head of Hindu might just move over onto another side created a tremendous anxiety. And this was when these privileged caste Hindu reform organizations suddenly came into being, you know, the Arya Samaj, the Brahmo Samaj, the Ramakrishna Mission, and they started proselytizing amongst untouchables, and they started speaking against untouchability but not against caste. So, because the whole thing was to bring this huge population into the Hindu fold, but to keep them in the servants' quarters.
The British had unknowingly set off a chain of events. An anti-caste movement sprung up all around the country. In Kerala, the Renaissance had begun. In the following section, I'm going to discuss a part of the anti-caste movements in Kerala and talk about social reformers who spent their lives struggling to uplift their fellow human beings. They are barely mentioned outside the state of Kerala, let alone the world, when it comes to conversations around caste. Social reformers like Ayyankali of the Puliya community, Sri Narayana Guru of the Erava community, Poykayil Yohannan of the Paraya Christian community, and so on, kickstarted a new era of social reform. Freedom of education, freedom of movement, freedom to enter temples, the right to wear clothing and jewelry that were outside the rules of what caste society had given them, the abolition of purity norms around food, interdining, intercaste and interfaith marriages. Ayyankali was born into the caste-ridden society of 19th century Kerala and considered a subhuman slave from birth. From an early age, he questioned the humiliating practices observed by the privileged to keep people in their place. The Puliya were barred from public roads, schools, places of government, temples, and so on. And Ayyankali led a militant agitation that spit in the face of caste society. Caste society wanted Dalit men and women to only wear the konagam, basically just a loincloth. Women were forced to wear iron earrings and stone necklaces to signify their social standing. Clothing and other caste identifiers were used to signify caste status within society. So Ayyankali's clothing itself was a form of protest. He wore a traditionally formal attire that was usually worn by privileged caste Nairs, and also made a statement by wearing white, a color that signified caste purity. One fine morning in 1893, Ayyankali bought a pair of healthy bullock. He wore a white turban and with his head held high, he drove through public roads, a direct challenge against Brahminical norms. For centuries, this basic right to use public roads had held communities back economically and developmentally. It alienated communities like the Puliya from engaging with the economy. To add to that, this form of travel was usually reserved for royalty and privileged castes as a symbol of status and power. Transgression of these norms was usually met with death, and privileged caste landlords tried to kill Ayyankali for this transgression. They attacked him in his cart, but he survived. This would trigger a chain of events that led to violent riots between the Dalits of the Puliya community and the landed Nair aristocracy. Even today, all across India, you can still see instances of similar situations, like the case of this Dalit groom being assaulted for daring to ride a horse to his wedding. By 1900, despite heavy opposition from the privileged castes, the marginalized had won the right to walk on public roads legally. In 1904, Ayyankali even started a school for the Puliya community, after the government had agreed to give financial aid to it. However, most of the Puliya families could not afford to send their kids to school yet, because in many cases, they would need all family members to participate on the fields in order to earn enough to put food on the table. And in 1909, Ayyankali led the first farmer struggle in Kerala. And it was launched in the name of being allowed to send their children to public school. Following this, the government had to legalize education for all. However, they had to keep it hush-hush for a while because the privileged caste communities did not want their children going to school with the marginalized out of fear of pollution. So as a response, Ayyankali organized the farmers to not work on the fields of the landlords. In spite of their poverty and already being on the brink, they continued the strike for more than a year, and at last the landlords were forced to concede. In 1915, Ayyankali walked Panchami, a Puliya girl, to an all-upper caste public school. The girl attended class alongside the privileged caste children of the neighborhood, but as a response, a mob of the privileged caste parents burnt the school down. Fortunately, this couldn't stop what had been set in motion. Reformers in Kerala like Ayyankali knew that education was necessary if they were to attain a more egalitarian society. The reason why Kerala boasts one of the highest literacy rates in the country today is because of this legacy of fighting for the basic right to education. Another important Dalit activist who many outside Kerala are not aware of was Poykayil Yohannan. He was a poet who was born a slave in 1879. Slaves were exchanged as package deals when trading land. They were given away as gifts and dowry, and were even used to pay off debts. And since a common practice in medieval Kerala was to give lands to Brahminical temples, those gifts of land also included attached slaves. Poykayil Yohannan's family were Pariah Christian slaves attached to the land of a Syrian Christian family of the Marthoma Church. Yohannan was expected to carry out daily work on the landlord's estate, like herding cattle or working on the paddy fields. Lucky for him, the people who owned him were not against the idea of him getting educated. So he was educated in a school meant for Pariah in order to teach them how to read the Bible. Yohannan took the opportunity, studied the Bible, and even became a teacher. He composed many religious songs. Yet, despite his growth within the Marthoma Church, he could not escape his caste identity and his birth as a slave within the community. So he left and joined the Reformist Brethren mission. He would bounce from church to church after that, seeing that caste-based discrimination was seemingly inescapable under the still existing Brahminical hegemony. So he set out to form his own religious movement. He noted that the Bible did not teach about the histories of his own people or the workings of caste and could not relate. He formed the Pratyaksha Raksha Deva Sabha, the PRDS, in 1909 to fight slavery. Some local sects of the Syrian Christian community found out about their meetings and deemed Yohannan the Antichrist and would attack him, but this didn't stop his lifelong struggle for emancipation. Now let's come to a man who Ayyankali himself called Guru. 1856 saw the birth of an Erva boy named Nannu. The Erva people, like other marginalized communities, were not allowed to enter temples and also were not allowed to worship Vedic deities like Shiva. From a young age, Nannu would question this control over education and the inaccessibility of worship. The state of life around him deeply disturbed him, and he decided to become a wandering ascetic, leaving behind his role as a teacher in his community. He would seek knowledge from sages who also desired a change in the dark society. He would become a prolific writer, and over time, people read his works and listened to his poetry. People were offered a glimpse into what was possible. He would gain immense popularity and be called Sri Narayana Guru, or the Kerala Buddha. His change of name from the more common Erva name Nannu to a more Sanskritized one was intentional. And just like Ayyankali, he broke the norms of clothing by dressing like a sage. Narayana Guru was also aware that caste was performative as well, and seeing how his predecessors like Aya Vaikundar were imprisoned and tortured for speaking out against caste norms, he chose to operate on the thin line that was acceptable to the establishment in order to turn the norms on its head and take back meaning. He became so influential that he was essentially able to appropriate Vedic religion itself in Kerala. In 1888, Narayana Guru took a rough-hewn stone from a river and installed it as a Shiva for his people to worship. Naturally, privileged caste people came out to confront him about breaking this caste norm. Traditionally, only Brahmin priests could consecrate an idol. Narayana Guru responded saying that it was an Erva Shiva. This satirical approach that poked fun at the ridiculous state of caste in Kerala became the man's hallmark. He would then go on to consecrate many more idols across Kerala in protest. He would meet and dine with young reformers like Ayyankali, which also broke caste norms between the Erava and the Pulaya, because they were also supposed to practice untouchability against each other. He was openly critical of the founder of Advaita Vedanta, Shankaracharya. He advocated for inter-caste and inter-religious marriage, even facilitating the wedding of a German Christian woman to an Erava man. His actions and agitations gained mass followers and shook the very foundation of Brahminical hegemony in Kerala. But Narayana Guru and his associates like T.K. Madhavan, Sahodaran Ayyapan, Kumaran Ashan, and Swami Ananda Tirthan knew that in order to get these changes to stick and have true lasting revolution, the people must all be educated and leave behind superstitions. So Narayana Guru shifted from building temples to building schools. They began to install mirrors in places of worship in order to remind the downtrodden that they were worthy of respect as they were. Narayana Guru agitated even against Theyyam rituals that involved forms of animal sacrifice and encouraged the embrace of rationality and scientific thinking. His movement did not even turn away privileged caste people who wanted to join in. It was the 20th century. The Bolshevik Revolution was underway in Russia and causing waves in India. Mussolini had made himself dictator of fascist Italy, and India's anti-colonial struggle was gaining steam. An 11-year-old Bhagat Singh had just walked the blood-soaked grounds of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. The Erava community at this time were in a unique position to impact the social fabric of Kerala. They were considered untouchable, but were the largest voting bloc in Kerala. 50% of the Erava today are Hindu, while the remaining are split between Muslims and Christians. Their material realities were better than that of the Paraya and the Puliya, which allowed them to have an earlier access to education. So when the British needed bodies to fill roles, the Erava could compete with privileged caste Nairs and Brahmins. It was this Erava bloc that fueled the anti-caste intelligentsia, and they were the early adopters of Marxist thought in the state as well, with workers' movements springing up from the popular coir factory industry. Following the lead of anti-caste reformers like Narayana Guru, Erava activists in collaboration with Dalit and progressive privileged caste groups would hold literary events, intercaste dining, and bring together labor unions, conferences, and more. The popularity of secular ideas to resist the conservative Brahmanism attracted privileged caste followers as well, because that is the inevitable outcome of an unsustainable, unjust system like caste that divorces individuality and expression from humans and turns them into a pawn to serve for the protection and maintenance of capital. Swami Anandatirthan is an example of this, being born a Brahmin but being one of Sri Narayana Guru's closest followers. Another example was Swami Dharmatirtha, formerly known as Paramswaran Menon. He was born into a Nair family, but he wrote the influential book that many progressive Indians refer to today, The History of Hindu Imperialism. An Erava follower of Narayana Guru, T.K. Madhavan, conceived of one of the most important anti-caste movements of the century, the Vaikam Satyagraha, which lasted more than 600 days. It was a non-violent agitation that brought together revolutionary figures from all parts of the country under the banner of the Untouchability Abolition Committee in order to agitate against the casteist practice of banning free movement around Vaikam Temple for marginalized castes. It brought together reformist Nairs like K. Kalapan, George Joseph of the Syrian Christian community in alliance with Puliya leaders like Amachadi Devan, Erava reformists and early communists like K. Ayyapan, and members of Congress like E.V. Ramaswamy Naikar or Periyar, who was still a member of Congress at the time. This united movement against caste, which also included prominent members of privileged caste communities like the Namboodiri Brahmins, the Nairs, and even the Velalar community from Tamil Nadu, against the casteist elements within their own communities, was unprecedented. Thousands of people came together to agitate. The Sikh Akali community led by Lala Lal Singh and Kripal Singh arrived just 2 weeks after the Satyagraha was announced. They set up langars to cook and serve chapati, dal and halwa. Fun fact, that's how Kerala got its chapatis. The Travancore police made arrest after arrest in collaboration with casteist counter-protesters. Gandhi eventually visited and played mediator between the parties. He was also honestly a huge party pooper, asking George Joseph and the Syrian Christians who were agitating against untouchability and showing solidarity to keep out of Hindu affairs. It reminds you that the so-called leaders of India at the time didn't really have an idea about the social, politics and fabric of Kerala. He also asked the Sikh langars to close shop and leave. However, he did negotiate a settlement in which the marginalized would be able to access 3 of the 4 roads around the temples. It would take another 10 years of agitation for people to be able to enter the temples. Sahodaran Ayyapan, a radical social reformer from my district of Ernakulam and the brainchild of the Mishra Bhojanam, the intercaste dining movement, took Narayana Guru's slogan even further. Jati Venda, Madam Venda, Devam Venda Manshine. In English, no caste, no religion, and no God for mankind. Through his magazine titled Sahodaran, he wrote poems like Curing Caste and the Book of Buddha. His writings struck at the heart of social issues in Kerala. He was a cultural critic who predated the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. Sahodaran Ayyapan was the one who introduced the word comrade to the Malayali lingo. He used the Malayalam word sagagale, or brothers, to mean comrade. He was the first intellectual and reformer in Kerala to openly criticize Gandhi and his form of nationalism. In the poem Gandhi Sandesham, he openly criticized his conservative outlook. He also embraced Navayana Buddhism, a political form of Buddhism reinterpreted by Ambedkar. In the poem Jati Bharatam, or Caste India, he predicted the rise of Ambedkarite movements and its impact on Indian society, democracy, and politics. He wrote about the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, an event that greatly resonated with the masses of Kerala, who still could not own any land. This renaissance was in no way easy. All these social reformers had to face casteism within their own communities. Sahodaran Ayyapan, for instance, was called Puliyan Ayyapan for dining with members of the Puliya community regularly. Over time, even Narayana Guru distanced himself from the inclusive party that was started in his name, the SNDP, because he realized that political parties based on caste identity were detrimental in ultimately achieving equality. A caste-based party, just like a race-based party, tended to evolve into ethno-nationalism because they tended to become exclusive. The question of caste still remains one that hasn't been adequately answered by any political party in India, and the struggle continues. So, let's summarize. The Jati Varna system, popularly known today as caste, is a Brahminical system of temple-centric resource management that used religious texts and the word of God as justification to keep certain lineages in a perpetual state of oppression. It has a lot in common with capitalism, like how it reproduces and perpetuates itself across generations in the form of generational wealth and family status. By implementing the system, entire lineages or jatis are victims of generational stigma, while a small minority at the top enjoy positive stereotypes just for being born, just for having a certain family name. Caste is not just about class and material wealth, though. It is about dignity and self-respect. The mere existence of caste today makes it possible for a child to inherit a harmful and discriminatory social status without their consent. It alienates human beings from each other and creates segregation. In other words, even if you do become successful monetarily, you're still discriminated against because the underlying assumption is that you didn't really earn it. However, the negative stigmas are not associated with successful entrepreneurs from privileged caste background, like actors or business people who are given the privilege of being titled self-made, hard-working, or more deserving, even though they might be beneficiaries of generations of caste privilege and wealth. And all this is maintained by controlling women's bodies, by avoiding intercaste marriage through violence and social ostracization. In his essays, Dr. Ambedkar spoke about how Brahmanism does not really need Brahmins to perpetuate it. We all have elements of Brahmanism within ourselves, and we need to be aware of those things and oppose it consciously. It might be a convenient path to point the finger at random people of privileged caste backgrounds today, but as you may have gathered through this video, that doesn't change the fact that casteism is also perpetrated by marginalized caste backgrounds. If we are to see true change in progress, we need to shed these ideas of biological essentialism. We need to stop monolithizing and homogenizing each other, because that is what keeps caste alive. When prominent sections within society deny that caste even exists or is a factor in the first place, how can we annihilate caste when we can't even agree on what it is, how it operates, and how it looks in society? I hope this video helped you understand this complex issue just a little bit more. Followers of the channel will know that I take quite a bit of time with my videos. I really don't want to put out misinformation in a world where misinformation feels like the norm. But I do wish I could get these out even quicker, as I read, research, edit, everything by myself at the moment, while juggling the rest of my life. So if you could share this video, that would be amazing. Don't forget to like and subscribe to nudge this monster of an algorithm as well. Thank you for watching, and special thanks to my patrons, DS, Gautam, Will, Darren, and Raghava. For anyone interested in supporting the channel via Patreon, you'll find a link below. See you next time.